Thank you. Thank you. How's everyone doing? I just want to start off with a very, very easy question before I get started on the talk, and that is, who here has gotten their flu shot this year? Wow, about half of you. That's pretty responsible. And the rest of you, I'm not really sure what to say, except for that I too am irresponsible. And I was reminded this morning walking by the CVS that told me that it is free and easy. And I know that it's a good idea to do, but I just didn't do it, just like every single year I don't do it. This is kind of sad, given that the probability of getting the flu is actually pretty high. I think it's around 20%. And getting a flu shot actually decreases the probability of getting the flu by about 60% and decreases the severity of it. So it's fairly irrational to not do this, yet we all do it. We all do it in some way. We procrastinate. We have lots of different ways that we are irrational in the world. It's actually quite common. This is a term in behavioral science that we call myopia. Has anyone heard the term before? Awesome, great. Well, the term is actually developed by ophthalmologists to describe what we know as short-sightedness or nearsightedness. And the term was co-opted by the behavioral science folks. This is an area that I studied in, so I know this term well, to describe short-sightedness in human behavior as well, so irrationality. And it's not just humans that do this, right? It's all kinds of things from humans, from individuals to companies. But one great example of this that I like from human behavior is in insurance purchasing. So one of my favorite studies showed that people are more likely to buy insurance, house insurance, after a natural disaster has occurred, right after a natural disaster has occurred, rather than before. Why? Because it's hard to think about the murky future and the risks associated with that when everything in your life is going just fine. So companies often do this as well. Many of you here are diversity and inclusion advocates for your companies or consultants working with other companies. And I'm sure you've all had the experience of trying to get buy-in from leadership and having them say, you know, that's a great idea, but we just don't have the money. And then maybe they turn around in a few weeks later or a few months or a few years, something bad has happened or you have some toxicity within your company. And then they're like, oh my God, we have to do something. Why didn't we think about anything like this before? And you're going, of course we did, you just didn't listen. We call this tactic firefighting. And companies are more likely to firefight, at least in my experience being a consultant. I think about like 90% of companies that come to me have had something bad happen in the recent past. And what I want to try to tell you today is that diversity, this kind of myopia, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion, is actually really risky business. And you only have to think about examples from recent history to understand why. This is becoming more common. There are costs associated to only thinking about your present state and not thinking about the future state when it comes to diversity and inclusion. There are legal costs associated. There are reputational costs. There are financial costs. There are PR costs. And as we know with that horrible soap dispenser that everyone has probably heard about by now that didn't dispense to people of color, there are actual product malfunctions as well. So there are lots of costs associated with this. And part of the problem is that people are not thinking about risks. So I'm going to argue that we need to build fire insurance instead of firefighting. And one way to do this is to think about risk and start thinking about diversity and inclusion in terms of a risk framework. And this is something that's very common in the business world. Pretty much every other business area is thought of in terms of risk, especially when businesses are getting up and started in the startup phase. People think about risk in terms of security, in terms of financial aspects. So why not diversity and inclusion as well? Now, this is kind of the opposite of a business case. So think about this. When you are trying to convince your key stakeholders to incorporate diversity and inclusion, we're almost always talking about the assets, the gains that you can get from diversity and inclusion. Oh, maybe we'll have more revenue if we have more diverse teams, maybe more creativity. I'm gonna try to convince you that this is actually the opposite tactic that we should be taking to actually get things to happen. And in order to do so, we can do what pretty much all companies have always done when it has come down to business risks, and that is use a risk management framework. VCs actually demand that you do this in order to get funding for your company. In a formal prospectus, there's always a risk factor section. We need to do this with diversity and inclusion as well. So I'm just going to walk you through the steps really quickly. The first step is to identify and assess the risks, and those are both the future risks and the current risks. The future risks, you can sit down and sketch out using a probability framework, the probability of something happening and the impact that it actually has on your organization. So let's take a sexual harassment claim. Very low probability of it actually happening, but a huge impact if it actually does. And then we want to develop an actual control to try to mitigate this particular risk. So maybe putting in a really great harassment policy, sitting down with lawyers and developing that is a great way to prepare for something like that ever happening. We can also assess current diversity and inclusion risks. So we often do this anyway. We're going to send surveys, this is especially good for companies that have already grown a little bit. Send surveys and see what's actually happening in your company right now. Is there a high or a low level of belonging? If so, what are the risks associated with that? You can also go externally and see, okay, what are people actually saying about our company? Maybe we can pick up on some trends that other people have thought about and we haven't. Or even just third-party apps and websites like Glassdoor. You can gain a lot of insight about what's going on through looking at those. Once you've assessed the risks, you want to try to develop and then implement controls in order to mitigate those. And I would urge you here, if there's one thing to take away from this, is that to focus on sustainable processes that are long-reaching and programs that can actually have a huge impact in your company, instead of low-hanging fruit like unconscious bias training, which is not a bad thing, but in isolation, it's not as effective over the long run. So focus on things that will build infrastructure in your company to set you up against random flames that might occur. Once you've actually implemented these, it's important to review them after a certain time has passed. Organizations are living, breathing things. They change constantly. Your people change constantly. 5 employees is very different than 500. So whatever thing you've implemented might not be sustainable after 6 months. And this is why it's also important to have really good systems of measurement. Internal benchmarks can help you understand what has changed and what kind of things you need to do in order to keep up with the times. So it's very important to be agile and to pivot when needed. And then I added this one in because I think it kind of brings everything together. And it's on communicating and buying and getting people to buy into exactly what you're doing. And you can use risk in this particular aspect as well. In terms of framing an argument, people are much, much more likely to actually respond to a loss or risk-based framing of an argument than they are to a gains-based framing of an argument. So let me explain. This is a concept from behavioral science. So think about this. If you were walking down the street and you knew you had $20 in your pocket and it fell out and you didn't have it anymore, that's actually a much bigger emotional impact on you than finding $20 on the street, because it's just so annoying. When you do this in terms of messaging, you can do this as well. Instead of saying, here's diversity in organizations can actually help us make more money to your leader, you could say not having diversity in organizations could actually set us up to lose a ton of money. That tiny shift, same content, different framing, will actually get you a lot more buy-in. I've actually been doing that this whole talk, by the way, by setting this up in terms of risk. Finally, you can get help for this, especially for those of you if it's kind of taken on a lot of this burden to try to run diversity and inclusion programs on your own. There's a lot to do, and there are people out there who can help you figure out the particular context of your organization and help you figure out what is the most bang for your buck and take you all the way through the assessment phase and help you with messaging and everything like that. So you don't have to be alone in trying to do this all by yourself. So I just want to end with saying that when we've talked about risk in regards to diversity and inclusion, I think what we most often hear is the risk of hiring people from non-traditional backgrounds. We often hear horrible phrases like lowering the bar. And this is, I think, thinking about risk in the wrong way. And I think we should reclaim the word and the concept of risk and turn it on its head so that we can actually be able to use it to our advantage. It's really important when we're actually trying to get things done to think about things in a tactical way. And business people do this all the time, and it's okay for us to do it as well. Let's be tactical and strategic if we actually want to get things done, and we can use social justice as our guiding star, but make sure that we're actually pushing people in the right direction. Thank you so much, and go get your flu shots if you haven't already.